Colin is a long-line naturalist and is the provincial arthropod zoologist of Natural Heritage Information Centre, Ontario Ministry of Natural Resource and Forestry of Peterborough, where he deals primarily with rare species, and has 29 years. He's been interested in Dragonflies and Damselflies, and he's published a field guides, Dragonflies, Damselflies, Algonquin Provincial Park in surrounding areas. So welcome, Colin. And I'm glad a lot of people have joined us. So I'll let you do your presentation.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Deanne. And it's great to see so many people on the call here, and great to see some familiar faces as well. I see a few people on the call who you probably aren't going to learn very much from me, because there's a few people on the call who know just as much or more about dragonflies than I do. So this is going to be very much an overview of this fascinating group of insects, a little bit about their life history, and a few other bits and pieces. I'm just going to launch the screen share here so I can get my presentation up. Hopefully that's viewable. Yes. Okay.
That's good.
Yeah, so as Deanne said, I'm the provincial arthropod zoologist with the Natural Heritage Information Centre, which is part of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. I'm based out of Peterborough. In our centre, we primarily work on rare species. So we generate species lists for the province, maintain the species lists with conservation status ranks, and then we track the occurrences of those that we have deemed to be provincially rare. So I work on the arthropods, including dragonflies and damselflies, but also all of the other arthropods that we have. We have been very successful over the past few years, working in conjunction with Environment Canada through the general status process of adding and ranking additional arthropods. So our lists of arthropods are ever growing, and we're starting to track some of the more obscure groups that we didn't really have on our radar before. But that's not the case with dragonflies and damselflies. We've been tracking them for quite some time because they're certainly a better known group of insects. Sorry, I'm just trying to advance this. There we go. So what I'm going to cover off this evening is we're going to start just basically identifying what dragonflies and damselflies are. And then we're going to move into the bulk of the presentation this evening, which is going to be about their life history. Dragonflies and damselflies have a fascinating life history, and those of you who've watched them in the field know they do all sorts of incredible things. So we're going to concentrate the vast majority of this presentation on this part of their life history and what it is they're doing and how you can go out and enjoy that yourself. And speaking of that, we'll also talk about the tools and the tricks you can have to identify the species that you're finding. This is my son Shan when he was quite a bit younger, chasing some sort of dragonfly, probably a clubtail, I imagine. And then we're going to, at the end, talk more about habitats that dragonflies and damselflies are found in, the diversity, overview of the diversity of species we have in the province, and some of the conservation actions that are taking place to protect those that are the rarest. So we'll dive right into the question of what are these creatures in the first place. Dragonflies and damselflies are an order of insects in the order Odonata, which basically means toothed ones because they have very teethy mandibles in the adult stage, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. There are two suborders of in this order Odonata. The first are the damselflies, the suborder Zygoptera. And this is a typical damselfly here. This is the Ebony Jewelwing, one of our most spectacular damselflies, with this beautiful emerald green body and these jet black wings. Damselflies tend to be smaller than dragonflies. They're certainly more slender. And when at rest, they hold their wings closed over their back, as you can see in this individual here. Zygoptera means basically even wings. And so their forewings and their hind wings are more or less the same shape. And so this is what Zygoptera means. There's always exceptions to nature, of course, and there is one family of damselflies called the spread wing damsels, where they break the rule of holding their wings completely folded over their back. This is an emerald spread wing, and you can see here that its wings are held out at about 45-degree angle to its body. So this is the one exception, is this family called the spread wing damsels. But unlike the dragonflies, which is the suborder Anisoptera, the dragonflies hold their wings out perpendicular to their body like an airplane. And this is a black saddlebags. You can see the black saddle, sort of like saddlebags here on the hind wing. And Anisoptera means uneven wings. So you can see that the hind wing is a different shape. It's broader, especially at the base, than the forewing is. So this is the order Odonata, comprised of these two suborders, the damselflies and the dragonflies. Water is critically important to dragonflies and damselflies because their larval stage is spent under the water. And and for most species, this is the vast majority of their life is spent under the water. It can be in the larval stage anywhere from a few months for some of the shorter or more quickly developing species, and up to 4 or 5 years for some of the larger species like our darners. This is a damselfly nymph or larva. This is the head up here. You can see the antenna, the body, and then off on the tip of the abdomen here are these caudal appendages. And those are basically used in order to help the damselfly breathe underwater. So these are flat, so a fairly large surface area, and that helps them extract oxygen from the water in order to breathe. Dragonfly larvae are different. They are not as slender, they're more robust, and they lack those caudal appendages off the tip of their abdomen. So you might ask, how are they breathing under the water? Well, they actually basically but suck in water right into their rear end here. And inside the abdomen, there are internal gills that extract the oxygen, and then they pump the water back out through their rear end to draw more in again for their next breath, essentially. So it's very similar to our lungs, where we bring air into our lungs, extract the oxygen, and breathe it back out again. They just do it through their rear end. This has an added advantage because they can very quickly expel that water as well and shoot themselves forward with jet propulsion. And this is effective at getting away from, would-be predators. Most of this presentation is photos, and most of the photos are my own, but I do have a few photos of other people and also some illustrations. Excuse me, I've got a nasty tickle in my throat all of a sudden. This is an illustration of the head of a typical larva of a dragonfly. You can see the eyes here. And what I'm trying to demonstrate here is this lower mandible, which when at rest is held underneath their head. And they use this to capture their prey. So they're basically ambush predators. They sit in the silt in the bottom of the stream or a pond or in the vegetation. And when a prey item comes nearby, this shoots out with lightning speed, and these little sharp mandibles here grab onto the prey, and then they bring that forward, and they use their true mandibles beneath their head here to feed on the prey item. What is it that dragonfly larvae, damselfly and dragonfly larvae are feeding on? Well, when they first hatch out of the egg, they're quite tiny. So they're feeding on tiny organisms like water fleas or Daphnia. And as they grow larger, they start to feed on larger and larger organisms, such as this back swimmer. And once they get to a certain size, especially that some of the larger dragonflies, they'll feed even on small fish, tadpoles, or salamander larvae like this blue spotted salamander larva. Once they are finished their larval period, which as I mentioned earlier, can be anywhere from a couple of months, 2 to 3 months for some of the shorter lived species, up to 3 or 4 years, they then crawl out of the water onto the bank of the stream or some vegetation or a dock. Those of you who have waterfront property, you've probably seen lots of dragonfly larvae on your dock emerging. And at this point, something really fascinating happens. And I've got a video clip to show the transformation from the larval stage to the adult stage, which I'm going to show you here now. This was taken by Doug Collicott from Manitoba, and it shows the emergence of the variable darner, Aeshna interrupta, and he uses time-lapse photography or videography to capture this. It usually takes about an hour for this whole process, but he has it sped up so that we can see it in just about a minute or so. Just going to get it running. There it goes. So here is the larva that's crawled up onto a piece of vegetation, and you can see that it's sort of pumping its body. And what it's doing is it's trying to split open its exoskeleton so that the adult can emerge from the larval casing. And you can see here that the thorax, the mid portion behind the head there, is starting to sort of crack open a little bit. The head capsule is now cracking open as well. And here comes the adult emerging from the larval casing. You can see the wings are coming out of the wing casings there, but they're all shriveled up at this point in time. The head is now popping out of the head capsule, and here comes the thorax. You can see the legs are starting to come out. And at this point, it uses gravity to help get the abdomen the rest of the way out of the larval casing. So it's just sort of hanging down, letting gravity do the work. And eventually it flips up, and the camera needs to move to catch this. It grabs onto itself or onto the vegetation, and out comes the abdomen. And at this point, it starts to pump the hemolymph, which is the equivalent of their blood, through the wing veins that essentially inflate the wings almost like a party balloon. And at the same time, the abdomen is starting to lengthen as well. And you can see the wings are getting larger and larger now as that hemolymph is being pumped through the veins. And eventually it gets to the point where it's looking pretty close to an adult. Now, Doug has here next morning, because in the lab, this was the dragonfly the next morning. But normally this takes about an hour, as I mentioned earlier, at which point the adult flies off from the pond or the stream, or the water body where it emerged, usually into some vegetation, where it then, the adult continues to basically mature. The sexual organs mature over the next few days, the body hardens up, and it's ready for its adult life. What's left behind is what we call an exuviae. And here's an exuviae here of boreal snaketail. And these can actually be identified to species. So this is an effective way of monitoring for some species, which can be very difficult to detect in the adult stage. Some species are thought to be canopy feeders and are seldom seen except when they're back down to the water body to breed. And some species are crepuscular. They're only active in the evening as the sun is setting, such as the Stygian Shadowdragon. And so monitoring a water course for some of these species is actually more effective by looking for their exuviae than the adults. And as I said, they can be identified to the species level. So in the adult stage, just like the larval stage, they are predators. And they have lots of features that enable them to be very effective aerial predators. So first off, they have these massive eyes. They have 2 compound eyes, each of which are made up of thousands of individual facets. And as you can see, almost the entire head is made up of eyes. And they can see in nearly 360 degrees. And they're very, very visual creatures. You can see that their antennae are very, very small. And so unlike many other insect groups, which use their antennae as sensory organs, the antennae of dragonflies and damselflies are thought to maybe help a little bit in flight navigation, but they're mostly visual creatures. Their wings are all independent of one another, and they can move independently, and this enables them to be incredibly agile flyers. Those of you who have watched dragonflies and damselflies flying around, you know that they can dart left, right, they can hover in one spot, and they can even fly backwards to a certain extent. So these wings make them very, very agile and very good at capturing their prey in flight. Their legs are all forward facing and they're spiny. And this basically forms a basket underneath their body. So as they're flying through the air, looking for prey, or if they're a species that sits in perches and flies out to catch their prey like a flycatcher does, they, regardless of the technique, they have this basket-like contraption with their legs that enables them to effectively grab onto their prey. And once they've done so, they can then use their legs to bring it up towards their mouth. They no longer have that foldable lower mandible like they do in the larval stage, but they have very, very strong mandibles here in their mouths that enable them to crunch through even the hardest exoskeletons, including things like beetles. And this is where the order Odonata comes from, toothed ones. So what are they feeding on in the adult stage? Well, they're feeding on all sorts of insects, but they're feeding primarily on flies. This looks like a wasp, but this is a canopid fly, thick-headed fly. So they'll feed on lots of different kinds of flies, including ones that tend to pester us, like black flies and deer flies and horse flies. Here's an eastern Pontoc, this beautiful female here with this lime color body, feeding on a horsefly, as an example. And they'll even feed on fairly large insects, including butterflies. There's one species in particular, the black-shouldered spiny leg, which seems to have a preference for butterflies. Every year, we have a dragonfly and damselfly count in Algonquin Park, and I go up and help coordinate that and participate in that. And just about every year during that count, I see a black-shouldered spiny legs either chasing or one that has captured a butterfly, quite often a fritillary, like this one here. And they'll even hunt their own kind. This is a photograph, not of my own, but from Michelle Porter in the Barry Aurelia area. And a fascinating photograph because it shows a lancet clubtail here that is actually caught and is consuming a stream cruiser, a dragonfly that's actually larger than itself. Now, the stream cruiser may have been injured, but nevertheless, dragonflies will hunt their own kind. And there's one in particular called the Dragon Hunter, aptly named because it does seem to specialize on hunting other dragonflies. They have their own predators as well, of course. Another photograph that's not my own. This is from Stuart Stick, in this part of the world where I live in Peterborough, Lindsay area. And it shows a common grackle with an absolute billful of young dragonflies that have just freshly emerged. These we call tendrils. And those of you who do a lot of birding, you've probably watched grackles and red-winged blackbirds walking along the shoreline of a marsh or a wetland during the month of June, picking things off. And what they're doing is they're picking off emerging insects, including dragonflies and damselflies, just as they're emerging, and they're bringing them back to feed the young in the nest. They'll also fall prey to spiders. Here's an American emerald that has been caught in the web of this orb weaver. It's going to be a significant meal for the orb weaver. And in sort of an ironic twist of fate, unlike the larval stage where the dragonfly larvae are often feeding on tadpoles, in the adult stage it's the other way around, especially in that tendril stage when the adult dragonfly is just emerging and it goes to make its little first flight off into the safety of the vegetation. Quite often they may get gobbled down by frogs like this green frog. And even plants. Those of you who are interested in plants know this plant. This is sundew, spatula leaf sundew. And they, of course, secrete this sticky, sweet substance on their leaves, which are meant to attract insects like flies. And although dragonflies are predators and they're not attracted to this, they may haphazardly land on sundew leaf just as a perch, and then the sundew begins to excrete its digestive enzymes and feeds on the insect, including these sometimes dragonflies. But if they manage to avoid these predators, they might get a chance to mate. And of course, the adult stage in all insects is primarily to find a mate so that they can breed and lay eggs and start their life cycle over again. And the next portion of this presentation, we're going to delve in a little bit to this part of their life history, because it's quite unique to insects, the way that they breed, and it's quite fascinating and very interesting to watch as well. This is a mating pair of rainbow bluets. So the first thing when a male is ready to mate, the first thing he does is he actually bends the tip of his abdomen over so that he can join the tip of the abdomen to the base of the abdomen. This is a blue-ringed dancer, and what he's doing is he's transferring sperm from the base of the abdomen here, or the tip of the abdomen, sorry, where it's produced, to the base of the abdomen in this particular move. And we're going to see why he's doing that a little bit later on. But before he mates, this is the first thing he does. And at the base of the abdomen is basically what we call secondary genitalia. And so there's a repository there for the sperm, but there's also some little tools here, which are called hamules. And it's a little bit like a Swiss Army knife. And there's a couple of tools there, which again, we'll learn a little more about just a little bit later on. So the sperm is transferred from the tip to the base of the abdomen, and then he begins to look for a mate. So he'll either perch somewhere and watch for a potential mate to fly in, or be patrolling up and down a stream or over a water body. And if he finds a potential mate, then he'll fly out and he'll attempt to grab that mate either behind the head in certain dragonflies, and in many damselflies, he'll actually grab her at the beginning part of the thorax, the middle part of the body. And the way he grabs onto her is with these appendages on the tip of the abdomen that are specialized. These are the appendages of the lance-tipped darner, and you can see why it's called lance-tipped, because the upper appendage here has this lance-shaped tip to it. And every species of dragonfly and damselfly have a different shape of appendages. Here's an illustration from a field guide to the Dragonflies and Damselflies of Algonquin Park, which we'll talk a little more about later on. And this shows the appendages of the Bluets, the group of the damselflies. And you can see that every species has a different shaped upper appendage especially. And these correspond to what are called mesostigmal plates here in the thorax of the female. So she has these grooves in these mesostigmal plates, and they basically are shaped in such a way to receive the appendages of the species, of the male of the same species. And so here are the mesostigmal plates of the same group of Bluets, and you can see they're all different shapes. And so it's a little bit like a lock and key mechanism. And so the male appendages really only fit effectively in the mesostigmal plates of the appropriate female. And this is one way that they avoid hybridization, although hybridization does occur in some species, some closely related species of damselflies. So once he's grabbed onto the female, it is then up to her to decide whether she wants to close the loop, so to speak, and breed with the male. If she chooses not to, then eventually the male will give up and let her go. But if she chooses to mate with the male, then she bends the tip of her abdomen around and joins the tip of her abdomen to the base of his abdomen so that she can receive the sperm. So now we're starting to understand why the male transfers the sperm from the tip to the base in the first place. This is already quite a maneuver that we're seeing here in this pair of ebony jewelwings. Just imagine how more difficult it would be if she had to somehow get the tip of her abdomen over her head and then join the base or the tip of his abdomen where the sperm is actually produced in the first place. So this is why the sperm is transferred, to make this much, much easier. This is often called the wheel position, but it's actually, in my mind, more appropriately called the heart position, because it does look much more like a heart than a wheel. And of course, they are in love. Once the female has received the sperm from the male, she can then go off and begin to lay her eggs. And in all of the damselflies, and in one group of the dragonflies called the darners, they actually have an ovipositor. And they use that ovipositor to inject their eggs into living or dead plant tissue. So here's a darner injecting her eggs into this living plant tissue, but some will inject their eggs into dead wood as well, including another one of the darners called the Fawn Darner. This is an illustration of what this ovipositor looks like. So you can see the sharp edge here, which is used to inject the egg. In all of the other dragonfly families, apart from the darners, they don't have this ovipositor. This is a eastern Pontoc female. This is the species we saw earlier feeding on the horsefly. And rather than having an ovipositor, they have a genital plate beneath the ninth abdominal segment. And basically the eggs come out from here, and they either form a string or, in some species, a ball. This is one of our endangered species. This is the Rapids clubtail. And you can see this female here, and you can see the tip of the abdomen, this ball of eggs starting to amass here. Shortly after I took this photograph, she flew out from her perch at the side of the stream over the rapids and began dipping the tip of her abdomen into the water several times, effectively washing those eggs off from her abdomen, and then they would have fallen down into the bottom of the stream. Many species of dragonflies, the female lays her eggs on her own. And in some species, the males will guard the female while she's laying her eggs by actively flying around and warding off any other males that might be in the area from attempting to mate with her. And in some species of especially damselfly, the male doesn't even let go of the female. So here we have two blue-tipped dancer males holding on to females, and you can see the females here, and you can see their abdomens are actually under the water, and they're injecting their eggs into this pondweed. And the males are guarding them so much that they're not even letting them go. This is making it impossible for any other male to come in and mate with that female. And this is important because then this is why many males guard their females, is if another male does come in and manage to grab onto the female, go back to that little toolbox of those hemules. One of the tools there in many species is a scoop that enables them to scoop out any sperm from a previous mating so that they can then replace it with their own sperm, ensuring that the offspring are their own rather than another competing male. And so this is why some species, like these blue-tip dancers, don't even let the females go, because they're ensuring by doing this that their sperm goes on to the next generation. But the question is, why don't all species do this then? Well, probably because there are inherent risks at this. And so certain species have evolved to do it, and other species have evolved to not do it. And this is one of the risks right here. This is a double-striped bluet female here, and here's the male. And if you follow the male's body upwards, you'll see that something's missing, the rest of the male. There's no thorax, there's no head, there's no wings. So in the process of guarding this female, probably a predator came along and grabbed onto the male and managed to feed on his head and thorax. And unfortunately now, those claspers are locked onto the female for good, because there's no brain to tell the claspers to let go. But that's the inherent risk, and that's probably why not all species have evolved to guard females. But if they're successful and the eggs hatch in the water body, then the next generation begins and the process starts all over again. So that's a summary of their life history, and it's really fascinating and quite unique. There really isn't any other species of insect that has that same kind of mating system that dragonflies and damselflies have. So that's a summary of their life history. And what I want to move on to now in the next portion of this presentation is a little more about how you can get out, learn more about dragonflies and damselflies for yourself, and also how you can contribute some of your observations to our growing body of knowledge on their status and distribution. This is my daughter when she was quite a bit younger, holding one of our nice big darners. These are my kids again when they were younger with their nets, chasing a Prince basket tail. And this is a very useful tool for studying dragonflies and damselflies. Many species are quite identifiable with just a pair of binoculars, but there are other species where it's very useful and in fact important in order to catch them so that you can look at them more closely, often studying those claspers we talked about a little bit earlier on to help identify them down to the species level. So a net is effective and important for identifying many species. And of course, you're going to want something to help you identify what you're seeing. And there's a growing number of field guides, ever-growing number of field guides available for these insects. This is one of the earliest field guides available in our area, northeastern North America, and it's certainly, in my opinion, still one of the best field guides out there in the world. This is Damselflies of the Northeast, written and illustrated by Ed Lamb, an incredibly talented artist. And it just focuses on the damselflies, but it is comprehensive, nearly comprehensive for Ontario. There's all but one species missing, and it's a species called the prairie bluet, which only just creeps into northwestern Ontario on the border with Manitoba. But otherwise, it's comprehensive for the province of Ontario and covers all of northeastern North America. When I first started studying dragonflies and damselflies in the early 1990s, there were no field guides. And myself and a few other keen naturalists in Algonquin Park were starting to learn them together. And we had to catch them, kill them, and then work them through the scientific keys in some of the older books, such as the classic 3-volume set by E.M. Walker, the Odonata of Canada and Alaska, which is still an incredibly important resource for anyone who's serious about dragonflies and damselflies. But as time went on, we started to learn more about how to identify them. We got to thinking, well, maybe we could do a field guide of our own. So two of the 4 are very talented artists, Peter Burke and Andrea Kingsley, and then myself and Matt Holder. We took care of the text. And so we collaborated together and put in a proposal to the Friends of Algonquin Park to work on this. It took us 10 years, but eventually we got it finished up, and it's now in its 2nd edition. And it is for dragonflies and damselflies of Algonquin Provincial Park and the surrounding area. In the surrounding area, we intended to make it fairly large. So it goes all the way from Georgian Bay, Lake Huron in the west, to the Ottawa Valley in the east, north to the Sudbury North Bay area, and down to the southern edge of the Canadian Shield. And in that area, this field guide is comprehensive. This is what it looks like in the inside, a typical plate. For some species, there's 1 species per page with male and female, lateral view, dorsal view, illustrations of their appendages and the genital plates of the females. And then on the side, on the other facing page, is the text description, similar species, habitat, behavior, flight period, status, and range. And here's a typical plate for the damselflies, which has often got 2 species per plate or per page. So once you've got yourself a net and maybe some field guides, you can go out and start exploring the dragonflies and damselflies in your area. And just like birds and birding, it's good to hit a variety of different habitats, because different habitats support different suites of species. And so slow, sluggish rivers such as this one here, you may encounter species like this beautiful violet dancer. And in some parts of the province, you might be lucky enough to find one of our provincially rare species. This is the flag-tailed spiny leg. This is really only found primarily in the Sydenham River in extreme southwestern Ontario. But in my opinion, it's one of the most spectacular dragonflies we have. It's got this massive big club and some beautiful colors as well. Certainly, once you get up onto the Canadian Shield, you get into some of these faster flowing rivers with clearer water, you get a different suite of species. You might encounter this swift river cruiser, a beautiful, spectacular species. I still remember the very first time I saw this species in Algonquin Park when I was a young naturalist working there. I couldn't believe this thing. It was massive and it had this big yellow spot on the tip of the abdomen. We had no idea what it was, but we just had to catch it. A beautiful, spectacular dragonfly. And then you get these shallow streams, clear streams with these protruding rocks like you see here. Great habitat for another one of our clubtails called the Eastern Least Clubtail, another really spectacular little species. Lakes support a different suite of species. Often many species that are found in rivers are also found in lakes, including this one, the dragon hunter. I mentioned it earlier on. So this is one of our largest dragonflies and is often hunting other dragonflies for their prey. Another illustration from the Algonquin Field Guide. And then ponds will have a different suite of species again. Species like this unicorn clubtail, the blue dasher, really spectacular skimmer, and the slaty skimmer. And then if you go and move on to peatlands, such as fens and bogs, you'll find yet another suite of species. And some of our more elusive and uncommon to rare species are found in these habitats, including the Ebony Bog Haunter, a great common name, and the smallest dragonfly we have in North America, the elfin skimmer. This is such a small dragonfly that it's smaller than most damselflies are. This is a female here. She's yellow and black. The males are sort of, they turn into a bit of a powder gray blue color. But she's so small, and because of her yellow and black coloration, when you first see this dragonfly, you might think you're looking at a hoverfly or a wasp or something like that, because she's just so tiny, and with those colors, it gives you that impression. And then if you're fortunate enough to get up into Ontario's far north, into the Hudson Bay lowland, where we have these extensive peatlands, taiga, tundra, you will see yet another suite of species, including many species in this genus called Somatochlora. And this is a ringed emerald. And many species of Somatochlora they're very northern in distribution for the most part. And the Hudson Bay lowland is a great place to see many of these Somatochlora species. Once you start identifying what you're seeing, you may want to start contributing your records to one or more sources. And there's a number of sources where you can contribute your records to. One is Odonata Central. This is a worldwide database, primarily North American, but it is worldwide in scope. And you can submit records to Odonata Central of your observations, including photographs, and they go into this large and ever-growing database. And these are mapped either you can see the point locations, or if you zoom out to a certain extent, as you can see here, this extent in the US, the records are mapped by county, and in Canada, they're mapped by these quadrangles here, lat-long quadrangles. But as you zoom into the map, you can see more precise coordinates. Another very popular and ever-growing data repository that many people, including many people here this evening, probably are using is iNaturalist. And again, you can submit your observations to iNaturalist of any taxonomic group, plants, animals, and even if you don't know what they are, the community will help you identify what you're seeing. So you could just load up a photograph of a dragonfly and say it's a dragonfly, and often within minutes, the community of experts out there will chime in with an observation for you. We at the Natural Heritage Information Center where I work have a project on iNaturalist, and this is another great thing about iNaturalist is you can set up projects to collate observations for certain groups of organisms, or in the case of our center, we have a project targeting all of our provincially rare species. And this has become an incredibly important way for us to get additional observations on rare species occurrences in the province of Ontario that we may not otherwise have got. And as you can see from the totals here, this screen capture I did a couple of weeks ago, but we're up to almost 70,000 observations, comprising almost 2,000 species of provincially tracked significance, and a total of 850 people have joined our project and have contributed records. So really important and ever-growing database, and these projects can help collate records for various purposes. And I should also mention that we at the Natural Heritage Information Center have a database of dragonfly and damselfly records for the province, the Ontario Odonata Atlas. And there is a significant stretch of time where through the Toronto Entomologists Association, a number of us, including Paul Catling, who I see here is on the call this evening. Hi, Paul. We did a yearly summary of records for the province, published it in a publication through the TEA called Ontario Odonata, and those records were also fed into the Ontario Odonata Atlas database. I'm still actively maintaining that database, and that's another source of data where people can contribute their records to as well. Because dragonflies and damselflies have become quite popular over the last 20 years or so, we've gathered a lot more information on their occurrences, and this has enabled more detailed species status assessments to be done by organizations, bodies such as CSIWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, and at the provincial level, CSIRO, the Committee on the Status of Species at Risk in Ontario. These bodies take all of the available information, run it through a formalized assessment set of criteria, and the species will often come out as endangered, threatened, or special concern. And those are then added to the federal and or provincial species at risk lists and are covered off eventually under the relevant acts. So we now have 6 dragonflies that are considered at risk in Ontario. The first one to be assessed was the Rapids clubtail. This is a male here. So Rapids clubtail is only known from a few rivers in southern Ontario, including one in your area, the Mississippi River, where there's a fairly good population. But unfortunately, in one of the rivers, the Credit River, that flows through the GTA, this species is thought to be extirpated. The reason for which is not entirely known, but it probably has to do with stream degradation over years. And this species, fortunately, seems to be now gone from the Credit River. But it is still known from the Humber River, an adjacent river that flows through the GTA. A lot of riverine dragonflies rely on natural erosional processes for their larval stage. So here in this stream, you can see this deposition zone here. And so this is where finer sand and silt is deposited as the stream naturally meanders through. And the deposition zone is created here, and many riverine dragonflies and damselflies rely on this deposition zone where their larvae burrow for protection, but also the area where they will hunt from. And so when erosion is controlled in this kind of fashion, these natural deposition processes no longer occur. All the fine sediments are washed down further stream, and the larval habitat is no longer there. Another endangered dragonfly I just thought I'd mention is the Heinz Emerald. This was the first dragonfly in the United States that was federally listed as endangered. And we, for many years, looked for this species in several parts of the province, and were very unsuccessful at doing so. But in 2007, a naturalist in the Barrie area happened upon an individual of the Heinz Emerald adjacent to the Minising wetlands. And subsequent studies have since shown that there's quite a good population there. It's the only location known in Canada for this species, and it too has been listed as endangered. And so there, as I mentioned, there's now 6 species that are covered under the Endangered Species Act, federally and provincially. And so these are offered some order of protection through those acts. And there's other species that are on deck to be assessed by CSIWIC and CSIRO as well. But not all species are rare. There's 177 species in total in Ontario, and many of these are common and widespread. They're not all considered to be rare or endangered, threatened, special concern. And this is just a few examples of some of those, some of that diversity. So, in summary, dragonflies and damselflies are fascinating organisms. They've got a really great life history that anyone can go out and even if you can't identify what you're seeing, fascinating group to just sit and watch as they go about their business. And we've touched on some of the additional ways that you can learn more about dragonflies and damselflies yourself. Another picture of my son when he was younger with interrupted Darner. And so with that, I hope I've inspired some of you who perhaps haven't been looking at these dragonflies and damselflies very much to get out and learn a little more. Perhaps for those of you who have, you've learned a little something extra that you didn't know. And there's probably lots of additional things that many of you on this call could impart to fellow members of the club as well, because I know that many of you here are also experts with this group of insects. So I want to thank you very much for having me speak to you this evening. And I don't know if we've got some time for questions or how you want to facilitate questions, but I'll turn it back to Deanne.
Yes, there's time for questions. And we have lots of questions on the chat. So I open up chat, but I don't see anything. Jacob, do you see the questions?
Yeah, I can read them off here if you like.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so the first question in the chat is, can you talk about dragonfly migration? What do we know about that?
That is a great question. And most dragonflies and damselflies are not migratory. So their entire life cycle is spent in, here in Ontario for those species that are found here. But there are a few species that are migratory, one of which is the common green darner. Common green darner is sort of the monarch of the dragonfly world. And up until relatively recently, we didn't really know very much about migratory dragonflies. We knew they migrated, but we didn't really know where they went. We didn't know how, too much about overall their life history. So a number of years ago, the Migratory Dragonfly Partnership was spearheaded. This was a tri-national organization with membership from here in Canada. I was on one of the members, United States and Mexico, and we started trying to learn a little more about what exactly was going on. And through that work, through some grants that went out to some research, including some stable isotope analysis that was done, we learned a little more about what was going on with common green darners. And so we now know that the common green darners that leave here in the fall fly to the southern United States, Mexico, even to northern Central America, such as Honduras, Guatemala. And they actually breed there, and it's their offspring that then migrate back northward the following year. And then their offspring breed in the north, and the cycle happens over again. So no, unlike monarchs where the adults migrate down to Mexico, they overwinter in a fairly small area in huge concentrations, and then those same individuals at least start the migration north again, and they breed in several generations as they move further and further north. Sorry, my cat's meowing here, you're probably hearing that. They only fly, each generation flies in one direction. So quite fascinating part of that life history. There's a few other species that are migratory, including wandering glider, the black saddlebags, which is the first dragonfly I showed you in the presentation. But even less is known about their migration. So, but the vast majority of dragonflies and damselflies are non-migratory.
Next question is, are there best practices for handling dragonflies if you're trying to capture and identify them?
Yes, absolutely. And so I'll just gonna go. Oh, I was gonna go back here in my slides, but it's gonna take me too long. Yeah. So the best thing to do is when you've got one in your net is to bring your fingers in and get your two front fingers and basically fold the wings up over their back. So even though in dragonflies, their wings at rest are held out like an airplane, they can still fold up over their backs like the damselfly can. So you go get your fingers in, fold those wings up over their back and pinch all four wings together in between your fingers. And that essentially immobilizes them. And so, and you're not going to damage them. They're not like butterflies where there's scales in the wings that you're going to rub off or anything. Their wings are quite rigid. And then that way you can then look more closely at the dragonfly. You can take pictures of it if you wish. And then when you're ready to let it go, you can just put it on your shoulder or on some vegetation and it'll fly off. And that is, it's important to get all four wings, because if you only get one or two of the wings, then it can flap around because its wings are so strong, its muscles are so strong, and it could tear off the wings and damage itself. But as long as you got all four wings together, it's immobilized and you're not going to harm it. The one exception to that is in that teneral stage. So when they've just emerged, their wings are quite fragile and much, much softer. And if you grab them at that stage, you can damage the wings. But once they're a full adult, as long as you're holding them that way, you really can't hurt them.
All right. Okay, we had a question that may have been answered by the chat. The question was, what are the most common and easiest to spot in the Ottawa region? But Chris Trainer has offered that big pond skimmers are often the easiest to spot. And I believe Jonathan Mack offered that he personally finds common whitetail and dot-tailed whiteface most often in various bluets and meadowhawks. Did you want to add to that at all?
No, that sounds great. I would agree. Right. Yeah, ponds are a wonderful place to see a variety of species and quite nicely. A lot of the skimmers will sit perched. They sit on vegetation and looking for prey, and then they fly out to grab it. And so with a good camera, you can get some wonderful photographs of many of the skimmers, and many of them are identifiable by photographs alone.
Great. Are dragonflies being used deliberately to control mosquito populations anywhere?
Well, there's a great myth out there that the Ministry of Natural Resources drops dragonflies every year by helicopter to control the biting insects, but that is not true. The myth, you can see where the myth came from, because many species have mass emergence, mass synchronous emergence. So those of you who are familiar with a species like the chalk-fronted corporal as one example, 1 week there'll be none around, and then the next week there just seems to be thousands of them. And so you can see how a myth like that could have come about. But no, it's very, very difficult to rear dragonflies and damselflies in any significant number to be used in any kind of control measures such as that. Lots of people have tried, lots of people worldwide have attempted, but in most instances, it's just not practical to do. So the best thing we can do is maintain our water bodies so that we can have a good, healthy population of dragonflies and damselflies to do the job for us.
Okay. How do you distinguish males and females? Is there something simple?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and so it goes back to some of the earlier slides that I had in the presentation. So males will have those appendages on the tip of their abdomen, and at the base of the abdomen they'll have that secondary genitalia. And whereas the females, at the base of their abdomen, there's no secondary genitalia at all. So it's just smooth, there's nothing there. And at the tip of the abdomen, although they may have appendages, in many species there are some sort of appendages there, they're not clasping appendages. And then the females will also have that ovipositor in the damselflies and the darners, or they'll have that genital plate under the 9th abdominal segment in the rest of the dragonflies.
All right. Is it possible to see dragonfly and damselfly records in the NHIC database? And is there something called a dragonfly atlas still in the works?
Yes, so we have, so all of the provincially rare dragonflies and damselflies, we have records in the NHIC rare species database. The dragonfly and damselfly atlas database, as I mentioned earlier, is, I still do maintain that. And those of you who are familiar with the Ontario Butterfly Atlas, there is an online mapping. The records are online, available through mapping, and that is through the Toronto Entomologists Association. And so, yes, we have been working towards a similar atlas online through the TEA for the dragonflies and damselflies. So that is a work in progress, and we're hoping that we're going to get there sometime soon.
Excellent. Dragonflies and damselflies have such a bizarre shape. What's in that long abdomen?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. The shape of dragonflies and damselflies probably has to do with aerodynamics. So they, as aerial predators, that long, thin shape and those big, strong wings probably are very important in enabling them to maneuver the way that they do. So a lot of the abdomen is, so the abdomen is where the respiratory processes are, as well as their reproductive organs. But the long, slender shape of it probably has more to do with those aerodynamics than anything.
Okay. What is the latest research? We're going to really open it up here. What is the latest research showing about the confusing white-faced, cherry-faced, and ruby meadowhawks in our area? Can we still identify male meadowhawks with bright white faces as white-faced meadowhawks?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So this is a suite of species that can be very confusing, especially in some parts of northeastern North America. But here in Ontario and some of the adjacent states such as Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, we don't seem to have as much complexity as there are in the eastern seaboard states. There seems to be a lot more variation there, seems to be more hybridization there. So from everything that so there have been some white-faced meadowhawks in the northeastern United States that have proven to be cherry-faced meadowhawks, for example. That doesn't seem to be going on here in Ontario. I haven't seen any evidence of that here myself. And the situation does seem to be more clear-cut with less variation and less hybridization. So, but there, not a lot of people have done detailed, formal research in that sense. as far as I'm aware anyways. I don't know if like Paul Catling is on the call here. I don't know, Paul, if you're aware of any more work that's been done, but I don't think there's been much really formal work done here.
I have nothing to add to that, Colin. I think you're right that the difficulties primarily exist in other regions, but there are occasionally odd ones we find in Ontario. And my thought on that, although I haven't researched it sufficiently to be sure, well, we're never sure. The currency of science is evidence, not proof. There we are. We have something for the night. Anyway, my thought on that, before I digress too much, is that they were hybrids. And I think there may be more hybrids in the Odonata than we realize. So it's a wonderful thing to study in much more depth, but it has to be studied over a broad region. And with all the current techniques with DNA and so on and so forth, in order to make appropriate conclusions, I think it's hard for citizen science to produce answers to questions like that, although citizen science can certainly be part of the solution. And of course, records and illustrations, photographs, and everything that's going on with platforms like iNaturalist, as you've pointed out yourself in articles, can be very helpful. So there's a lot that we can all do, but we're not all in a position to figure it out. And unfortunately, the problems go way beyond Ontario, and the problems are worst in Ontario, outside Ontario, where they have the best chance of being addressed with a solution, I think. That's all.
Great, thanks, Paul.
Okay. Thank you. All right. I have a question about eye color. Does eye color change, or is it diagnostic of species or gender in any cases?
Yes, eye color does change. So in many species, when they first emerge, the eyes are just sort of a grayish color. And then in many species, they turn a much more brilliant color. So you can see if my screen is still being shared, this calico pennant on the screen here, it's got these nice reddish brown colored eyes in the full adult stage. And then many species have beautiful green eyes. So a lot of the emerald dragonflies from the emerald family, Cordyliidae, have beautiful emerald green eyes. Some of the clubtails also have beautiful green eyes. And then other species will have blue eyes. So there's several species that produce these magnificent blue eyes in the adult stage. So yes, they can change color as they age, and many species have really spectacular colored eyes.
Excellent. I'll just mention Jeff Skevington has shared in the chat. There is a new paper on Odonata phylogeny that was just published this week for anyone interested in relationships among the major groups. And he's provided the DOI link to that paper. And that likes to read those. That's there in the chat. So if you're on and you want to read that, I'd grab the link before the call ends.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. On the scooping out of another male's sperm packet, does the tip of the male abdomen scoop out the tip of the female's abdomen? Can you clarify?
No, so that scoop is in that secondary genitalia at the base of the male's abdomen. So he'll grab her behind the head with those claspers, and then if she chooses, even though she's mated before, if she decides to mate with the second male, then she'll form that loop again, join the tip of her abdomen to the base of his abdomen, and that's where the scoop mechanism is, the base of the male's abdomen.
Excellent. go back a little bit in time. Where were dragonflies first known on Earth? Are there records are there fossil records?
Yes, there absolutely are fossil records. And in fact, some of our prominent Canadian ornithologists, paleontologists from the Royal BC Museum just published a paper describing several new fossil species of Odonata from the fossil record. So yes, and they are ancient, an ancient lineage, and many of the species in the fossil record are extremely similar to the individuals that we see today, and that's just a testament to, you know, how effective that body shape is at doing what they do. So they haven't really changed much over time through evolution. They're very, very similar to the way they were in the fossil record.
Excellent. Are there still a few species that have not been recorded in Ontario, but possibly occur in Ontario in small numbers or in remote areas?
Yes, absolutely. And you know, with the increased interest in dragonflies and damselflies, we've on average, there's been about like a new species discovered every year over the last 20 years or so. And there's still some that very likely occur here that we have not yet found. So there's a species called the gray petal tail as one example. It's found in New York State, like not far across the border. They like seepages, and so I've always thought that some of the seepages in the Niagara Gorge would be an excellent place to look for gray petal tail. I've looked for them myself there unsuccessfully, and I'm sure others have as well, but it is yet to be found. But there's a good chance that it occurs, and there's a few others as well that fall into that category.
Yeah, it's very interesting. One last question, I think. Do any dragonflies or damselflies in our area overwinter as adults?
No, they do not. So unlike some of our butterflies, which have the ability to overwinter in the adult stage, mourning cloak and Compton's tortoiseshell, dragonflies do not have that ability. So they all either overwinter under the water in the larval stage, or in the case of the migratory species, they migrate.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for your excellent questions. Thank you, Paul Catling and Jeff Skevington, for your contributions here as well, and Jonathan Mack in the chat. Thank you. But most importantly, Colin, thank you very much for giving us talk to us this evening. Much appreciated, and you know, it's nice to be able to connect and have these discussions while we're all staying apart.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again very much for having me. Enjoyed seeing a lot of familiar faces, and yeah, the other advantage of doing these virtual things is that people from elsewhere can join in. So, you know, we've got Richard Napton here. Oh no, of course, Richard's in the Ottawa area now. What am I saying? But a couple of weeks ago, I did a similar presentation for the Hastings Stewardship Council, and had some folks from British Columbia coming in on the call. So yeah, great advantage of, there are some advantages to these virtual meetings.
Mhm.